They laughed before he even opened his mouth. That's the part that stays with you. Not the insult itself. Insults you can process, file away, eventually forget. It's the laughter that lingers. The casual, unhurried laughter of people who've never once had to think about whether they belonged somewhere. Desmond Okafor had been standing in the service bay of Harrington Precision, Automotive Field, for exactly 43 seconds when the laughter started. He was 61 years old. He'd driven 4 hours from Sudbury in a rental because the dealership told him, twice, politely, then less politely, that nobody in Northern Ontario was certified to work on a Bugatti Chiron. Not the car sitting in his driveway. Not the one he'd been quoted $34,000 to fix at the only certified facility in Ontario, which happened to be this one, right here. On the outskirts of Mississauga, in a building that smelled like hydraulic fluid and quiet money. He was wearing a Carhartt work jacket he'd had since 2009. His boots had mud on them from his property. He hadn't shaved. And the moment he walked through the side entrance, the one the receptionist had directed him to, because clients usually use the main door, sir, the one on Argentia Road. Two of the technicians looked up from a lifted Porsche 911, and one of them said something to the other, low enough that Desmond couldn't hear the words, but he could hear what followed. That sound. That particular frequency of dismissal. If you've ever heard it, you know exactly what it sounds like. If you've never heard it directed at you, there's no way to explain it in a way that fully lands. Like button if you've been in that room before. Harrington Precision was not the kind of shop that put its prices in the window. The waiting area had leather chairs that looked imported. There were framed photographs on the walls. Racing circuits, Le Mans, Silverstone, a black and white shot of a Formula One car that Desmond recognized as a 1970s Tyrrell. The coffee machine was the kind you'd find in a boutique hotel. The service manager who came out to meet him was a man named Fletcher, mid-40s, with the clipped efficiency of someone who decided things about people in the first 3 seconds. Fletcher looked at Desmond, then passed him at the car outside, which Desmond had driven in himself, running rough on 3 cylinders, the W16 misfiring badly enough that the drive down Highway 400 had been genuinely unpleasant. Then Fletcher looked back at Desmond. "Are you the delivery driver?" he said. Not a bad question, on the surface. People delivered cars all the time. It was a reasonable logistical assumption. Except it wasn't a logistical assumption. Desmond knew that. Fletcher knew that. The receptionist hovering behind the front desk knew that, because she'd looked up and then backed down very quickly, the way people do when they want to appear uninvolved in something they are very much involved in. "I'm the owner," Desmond said. Fletcher's expression didn't change. That was actually the more unsettling version. Not the kind that shifts into embarrassment or overcorrects into false warmth, but the kind that simply continues, uninterrupted, like the information had landed somewhere and been quietly filed under irrelevant. "Of course," Fletcher said. "Let's get some information." He pulled out his tablet. "Subscribe to Birthright Tales if you want to see what happens when people underestimate the wrong person. Because this story is only getting started." Desmond Okafor had grown up in Timmins, youngest of 4 kids. His father, Emmanuel Okafor, had emigrated from Enugu State, Nigeria in 1973 with a degree in mechanical engineering that Canadian licensing boards spent 3 years refusing to fully recognize. Emmanuel had eventually gotten certified, the long way, the hard way. The way that involved night school and day labor, and a particular brand of quiet determination that his son had absorbed without being taught it directly. Emmanuel Okafor had worked for 31 years at a mining equipment company in Timmins. He'd retired as chief engineer. He never talked much about the early years. Desmond had gone a different direction. Forestry equipment supply, which turned into a small contracting business, which turned into a larger one, which turned into a company with 68 employees, and contracts with 4 of the largest mining operations in Northern Ontario. He'd sold a majority stake in 2019 and retained a consulting role that paid him more per month than most people earned in a year. He didn't own the Bugatti to show off. He'd bought it because he'd turned 60, and he'd worked for 40 years, and he'd decided, quietly and without ceremony, that he was allowed to want something beautiful. His late wife, Marguerite, had encouraged it. "Get the car, Des," she'd said 6 months before she got sick. "Get the car." So he'd gotten the car. And now the car was sitting in a bay at Harrington Precision, while a man named Fletcher explained, with professional patience, that the issue was likely the fuel injection system, a known problem on the Chiron's W16 at high mileage, and that the lead technician, someone named Rowan, had already looked at it and estimated a significant rebuild. "How long?" Desmond asked. 3 weeks minimum. Possibly 5. Desmond nodded. He asked a few questions. Specific questions, technical ones, the kind that required real knowledge to answer accurately. Fletcher answered them with the smoothed-over confidence of someone who knew the vocabulary but not necessarily the grammar. Desmond didn't push. He said he'd wait for the full diagnostic. He drove back to the hotel the dealership had arranged for him. He ordered room service. He went to sleep. He was back in the bay at 8 the next morning. The lead technician, Rowan Giles, was a lean man in his late 30s who had the hands of someone who'd been working on engines since before he could legally drive. He was, Desmond noted, genuinely skilled. You can tell. There's a way that technically proficient people move around machinery. Unhurried, certain, with a quality of attention that looks almost like affection. Giles moved like that. He was also, in the way of certain men who are very good at one specific thing, completely unwilling to be wrong in front of an audience. The bay had 4 other technicians working in it that morning. 2 of them were the ones who'd laughed the day before. Desmond recognized their posture, if not their faces. Giles had been at it since 6. He'd pulled the fuel injection system, inspected the injectors, run a pressure test, replaced 2 injectors that showed wear, and reconnected the system. He ran the engine. It still misfired. Badly. Giles ran the diagnostic again. He pulled a different component. He checked the connections. He ran the engine again. Still misfiring. He brought in another technician, older, quieter, someone who moved with the economy of a person who charged by the answer, not the hour. They consulted in low voices over the diagnostic readout. They tried something else. The engine fired, ran for about 40 seconds, then dropped back into the ragged, lurching misfire that Desmond had driven down the 400. Giles stood up. He had grease on his forearm and a look on his face that Desmond recognized. Not from cars, but from engineering meetings, from project reviews, from the particular moment when a problem refuses to be what you've decided it is. That's when things tend to go sideways, not when people fail. When people fail and have an audience. One of the other technicians, the younger one, early 30s, with the energy of someone who'd been hired recently and was still performing for approval, said, "Maybe it's something in the management system. Could be a firmware thing. These European systems are." "It's not the firmware," Giles said. Flat, definitive. The younger technician subsided. Desmond had been standing near the wall. He'd been watching for about an hour. He hadn't said anything, because he understood, from long experience, that the most useful thing you could do when skilled professionals were working was stay out of their way and pay attention. But he'd been paying attention, and he'd noticed something, about 20 minutes into watching, that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about since. He was about to say something when Fletcher appeared. Fletcher had clearly been informed, by someone, through the particular communication channels of a workplace, that things were not going well. He arrived with the energy of a man who needed to manage a situation before it became a problem. "Mr. Okafor," he said, "I want to update you on where we are." "I can see where you are," Desmond said. A small pause. "Yes, well, we've identified some complexity in the fuel injection system is fine," Desmond said. Fletcher stopped. Giles, across the bay, turned his head. "The injectors you replaced were worn, so that was worth doing," Desmond continued. "But that's not what's causing the misfire. It's a secondary ignition issue. The coil pack on cylinder bank 7 has an intermittent short. It's temperature dependent, which is why it doesn't show consistently on the cold diagnostic. You need to run the engine until it's fully up to operating temperature, then run the diagnostic while it's hot. It'll show on the oscilloscope." The bay was quiet. Giles was looking at him now, not with the contempt of before, with something more complicated than that. The W16 runs two independent ignition systems, Desmond said. When Bank 7 drops out, the engine compensates briefly, which is why the misfire is intermittent rather than constant. That's also why it got worse on the highway. Higher RPM, more thermal load, the short becomes more frequent. Fletcher looked at Giles. Giles looked at Desmond. Desmond waited. If you've ever been the person in the room who knows exactly what's wrong and had to wait for everyone else to catch up, drop a comment below. Because Desmond waited. He was good at waiting. Giles crossed the bay slowly. He picked up the oscilloscope lead. He didn't say anything. He connected it, let the engine warm properly. Full temperature, 15 minutes of idling, and then ran the test. The readout came up on the screen. Cylinder bank 7. Intermittent voltage irregularity. Clear as a line on a map. The younger technician, the one who'd laughed yesterday, made a sound that was almost inaudible. Not quite a word. Something between acknowledgement and discomfort. Giles straightened up. He looked at the readout for a long moment. Then he looked at Desmond. "How did you know to look there?" he said. "Because when you ran the first pressure test," Desmond said, "Bank 7 was 2 milliseconds behind the others on ignition timing. It's subtle, but it's consistent." Giles was quiet. "My father was a mechanical engineer," Desmond said. "He taught me how to read a timing sequence when I was 14. I've been taking machines apart since before I could drive legally." Another silence. Then Giles said, "It's going to need a new coil pack. And we'll want to check the wiring harness on that bank while we're in there." "I'd expect so," Desmond said. 2 days, Giles said. "Maybe 3. All right." Fletcher was still standing near the entrance to the bay. Desmond walked toward him. Fletcher seemed to become suddenly interested in the tablet in his hands. "I'll need an updated quote," Desmond said, "reflecting the actual repair, rather than the fuel injection rebuild you initially proposed." "Of course," Fletcher said. His voice had changed texture, still professional. But the smoothed-over confidence was gone. What was left underneath was something thinner. "I'll also need confirmation in writing that the injector replacement will be itemized separately at cost," Desmond said, "given that it wasn't the source of the problem." Fletcher looked up. "That's standard practice when a diagnosis is revised," Desmond said pleasantly. "I'm sure you're familiar with the process." "A beat." "I'll have the service coordinator draw that up," Fletcher said. "Thank you," Desmond said. "I appreciate the professionalism." He said it the way his mother used to say certain things. Quietly, with complete composure, and in a way that meant something entirely different from the words themselves. He called his daughter that evening. Adèle was 34, a civil engineer with a firm in Ottawa, and she had her grandfather's patience and her mother's laugh, which she deployed now. "Dad, you diagnosed a Bugatti while standing against a wall. I was just watching. While they charged you for 3 hours of work to replace the wrong thing. That'll get sorted out." "I know it will," she said. "But I want to hear how." Desmond told her about the oscilloscope reading. About the timing sequence. About Giles's face when the readout confirmed what Desmond had said. "Did anyone apologize?" Adèle asked. "Giles nodded at me when I left," Desmond said. "That's roughly equivalent." Adèle laughed. That laugh, Marguerite's laugh, the one that filled up a room even through a phone speaker. "And Fletcher?" Fletcher said, "Of course, a great deal." Classic. Desmond was quiet for a moment. Outside his hotel window, the 401 was a ribbon of red and white light. "Grandpa would have liked this car," he said. "Grandpa would have had it apart and improved by now," Adèle said. He laughed at that, genuinely. "Get some rest, Dad. Make sure they fix it right. I'll be watching," he said. "I'm good at watching." Subscribe to Birthright Tales if stories like this matter to you. A new one every week. Day 2 of the repair started early. Giles had clearly been in since before opening. When Desmond arrived at 8, the engine cover was already off, and Giles was crouched over the cylinder bank, with a methodical focus that Desmond respected. The younger technician, Desmond had learned his name was Joel, was working quietly nearby. Joel had lost whatever performative quality he'd had the day before. He was just working now. Focused, which was, Desmond thought, a better version of him. The third technician in the bay that morning was a woman named Paulette Sears, who handled the wiring diagnostics and who turned out to be, in Desmond's assessment, the most technically precise person in the building. She moved through the wiring harness on cylinder bank 7 with the particular care of someone who understood that precision and speed were not the same thing, and that one of them mattered more. Paulette Sears didn't laugh at Desmond. She hadn't the day before either. He'd noticed that at the time. She'd been at a workstation in the far corner, working on something else, and she'd glanced over once, with the neutral assessment of a person with nothing to prove. Around 10, she looked up from the harness and said, "There's a secondary fault here. Not just the coil pack. One of the ground connections on the harness has been intermittently unseated. Factory defect, I think, or early wear. It's been contributing to the problem." "How long has it likely been doing this?" Desmond asked. "Hard to say. Months, maybe. You might have been noticing small things before the full misfire started." He had been. A slight hesitation at high RPM. Twice. A vibration through the chassis on the highway that hadn't resolved the way it should have. He'd mentioned it to the dealership, and they'd run a diagnostic and found nothing. They wouldn't have found this on a cold diagnostic, Paulette Sears said, not quite to Desmond, not quite to herself. Just stating a fact, the way technically honest people do, without needing to score a point from it. "No," Desmond agreed. They wouldn't. By the afternoon of the third day, the car was ready. Giles ran it through a full warm start diagnostic before Desmond arrived for the final walkthrough. He didn't have to do that. The standard process was a cold start and a short run cycle. But he ran the full thermal test, which took an extra hour, and the results were clean. Every cylinder, every bank, every ignition sequence running within factory specification. When Desmond pulled up the readout on the tablet Giles handed him, the numbers were exactly what they should be. "Good work," Desmond said. Giles accepted that without performing anything, just a nod. The kind that means something. At the service desk, the revised quote was waiting. The fuel injection work had been itemized. The diagnosis correction was noted. The final number was significantly lower than the original estimate. Not low, because none of this was ever going to be low, but accurate. Fletcher was not at the desk when Desmond finalized the paperwork. The service coordinator, a careful woman named Bridget Chow, who had the competence of someone who actually ran the place, handled it efficiently. "Is there anything else we can do for you, Mr. Okafor?" she said. "The technician Sears," Desmond said. "She identified a secondary fault that probably wasn't in the original scope. I'd want that noted in her file." Bridget Chow looked up. "She saved you additional repair costs down the line," Desmond said. "That's worth noting." "I'll make sure of it," Bridget Chow said, and from her tone, she meant it. Desmond drove the car out of the bay just past 4 in the afternoon. The engine turned over without hesitation. Even at idle, there was a quality to it. A settled, authoritative rumble that had been missing since before he could remember. He'd gotten so used to the rough running that the correct version felt almost unfamiliar. Better than memory. He sat in the parking lot for a moment with the engine running. Just listening. He thought about Emmanuel Okafor, who had explained ignition timing to a 14-year-old in the driveway of a rented house in Timmins, using a 1981 Buick with a carbureted engine and more rust than paint, who had said, more than once, that the machine doesn't know anything about you. It only knows what you know. You bring what you know, and the machine tells you the truth. He thought about Marguerite, who would have been in the passenger seat, window down despite the November cold, because she loved moving air, saying something that would have made him laugh. He thought about a Daisy in Ottawa, probably already in her second meeting of the day. He put the car in gear and pulled out onto Argentia Road, heading for the on-ramp to the 401. The engine ran perfectly, all 16 cylinders, both banks, every ignition sequence exactly as it should be. The call from Fletcher came 2 days later. Desmond was back in Sudbury by then. He was standing at the kitchen window with a coffee when his phone rang, and he almost didn't answer it because he didn't recognize the number, and then the area code registered, and he did. Fletcher's voice was different on the phone than it had been in person. More careful, less polished. "Mr. Okafor, I wanted to follow up on your experience with us." "It was fine," Desmond said. "The car's running well." A pause. "I wanted to, and I recognize this may be overdue, I wanted to apologize for how the initial interaction was handled. When you arrived. The assumption that was made. Desmond looked out at the birch trees at the edge of his property. The first snowfall of the year was still on the branches. In the distance, a woodpecker was working on something. I appreciate you saying so, he said. Another pause. Fletcher seemed to be measuring his next words. We've been doing some internal review, Fletcher said, about how clients are received when they come through the service entrance. There have been some patterns that are worth addressing. That's good to hear, Desmond said. I wanted you to know that's happening. I believe you, Desmond said. And then, because he meant it and not for any other reason. The technicians were good. Particularly Sears. She's the reason the car is actually fixed. Yes, Fletcher said. She's very good. She is, Desmond said. Make sure she knows you think so. He could hear Fletcher processing that on the other end of the line. We will, Fletcher said. Mr. Okafor, thank you for your patience. Desmond thought of many things he could have said to that. Take care, he said instead. He hung up, finished his coffee, stewed looking at the birch trees for a while longer. Then he went to the garage. He had a 1981 Buick in there, not the same one but the same model, found at an estate sale in Kapuskasing, bought on an impulse that he'd never once regretted. It needed a carburetor rebuild. He put on his work jacket, the Carhartt one, from 2009. He opened the garage door, let in the November air, put on the radio, and started working. If this story found you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want more stories about people who carry more than they're given credit for, subscribe to Birthright Tales. We'll be here every week.